The wheat was on fire. Not much of it. Just a rough circle at the far end of old Garrett's field, where something had come down hard and fast and left a black scar in the dirt. The smoke was thin and white, rising straight up into the still afternoon air like a signal no one had asked for. Bryn saw it first. He was up in the old apple tree at the edge of the property, not doing anything useful, which was his specialty. He spotted the smoke, stared at it for about 3 seconds, and then dropped out of the tree and ran. He found Dolly at the fence line, already looking in the same direction. "You saw it too," Bryn said. "Heard it," Dolly said. She had her small notebook in her hand, already open. She always had that notebook. It sounded like metal, not like a plane. Too short, too sharp. Pip came around from behind the water trough, muddy up to both knees, holding a frog that seemed as unbothered as she was. "Are we going to look?" she asked. They went to look. The walk across the field took about 10 minutes. The wheat was tall and dry, and it brushed against their arms as they pushed through it. The smoke smell got stronger. When they finally broke through to the clearing, all 3 of them stopped at the same time. It was a ship. Not a plane, not a drone, not anything with wings or wheels or anything that belonged to any country or company any of them had ever heard of. It was roughly oval, about the size of a delivery truck, made of something dark and dull that was not quite metal and not quite stone. It had come down at an angle and plowed a long groove into the earth. One side of it was cracked open like an egg. Steam or smoke, it was hard to tell which, curled out from the gap. The 3 children stood at the edge of the scorched circle and did not run. Bryn crossed his arms. "That is not from here." "No," Dolly agreed, writing something in her notebook. Pip let the frog go. She took a step forward. "Pip," Bryn said. Pip took another step. What came out of the crack in the ship was small. That was the first thing. Whatever they had been imagining, and they had each been imagining something different, none of them had imagined small. It was maybe the size of a large dog, low to the ground, moving on 4 legs with its belly nearly dragging. Its skin was dark green and rough, like the rind of something ancient. It had a long neck, a narrow flat head, 2 folded things on its back that might have been wings except they were tucked so tight it was hard to be sure, and a tail that dragged behind it in the dirt. Its eyes were gold, very gold, almost lit from inside. It looked at the 3 children. The children looked at it. The creature opened its mouth and showed a row of small, very white teeth. Then it made a sound, a low, rattling hiss that started in its chest and came out like a warning. Pip reached into her jacket pocket, took out a granola bar, and held it out. The creature stopped hissing. It stared at the granola bar. It looked at Pip. It looked at the granola bar again. Whatever threat display it had been attempting, it abandoned. It lowered its narrow head and sniffed at the air between them. Then, with great suspicion and absolutely no dignity, it shuffled forward on its 4 legs and sniffed the granola bar directly. It pulled back. It sniffed again. Then it took the granola bar gently out of Pip's hand with its front teeth and ate it in 2 bites, wrapper and all. It sat back on its haunches. It blinked its gold eyes. "Okay," Bryn said slowly. "It eats." Dolly said. She was watching the creature closely. "Look at the scale pattern around the neck. It's lighter than the rest. I think that usually means female and reptiles." She paused. "I'm not totally sure that applies here." The creature was looking at Dolly now with an expression that was hard to read, but seemed curious. Dolly held up her notebook and showed it to the creature, as if that meant anything. The creature tilted its head. Then it did something none of them expected. It made a sound, not a hiss, not a growl, something more like a series of short, clicking syllables, rapid and precise, like a code being read aloud. "Is that language?" Bryn said. "Yes," Dolly said immediately. The creature clicked again, differently, watching their faces. Bryn pointed at himself. "Bryn," he said. The creature stared. He pointed again. "Bryn." A pause. Then the creature opened its mouth and produced something that was almost the right shape. "BRRN." Bryn's eyebrows went up. He pointed at Dolly. "Dolly." "DH Lee." He pointed at Pip. "Pip." The creature looked at Pip for a long moment. "Pip," it said, almost perfectly. Pip grinned. "She's smart." "Extremely," Dolly said, writing fast. The creature looked back at the broken ship behind it. Something moved across those gold eyes. Not quite worry, and not quite sadness, but something in that neighborhood. It made a low sound, quiet and short, and then looked back at the children with an expression that needed no translation. It was stuck. Bren looked at Dolly. Dolly looked at Pip. Pip looked at the creature. "We have a barn," Pip said. The creature did not know what a barn was, but it seemed to understand the tone, the straightforward, practical offer in Pip's voice, the way she said it like it was obvious. It got up on its four legs and waited. Bren looked back across the field toward the farmhouse, then up at the sky, then at the ship, then at the creature. "If we move fast," he said, "no adults will see us before dinner." They moved fast. Getting the creature across the field was easier than expected because she was low and quick and the wheat was tall. Getting her into the barn was harder because she did not immediately trust the door, which was narrow, and she had to be coaxed through it by Pip walking in first and turning around and waiting. She came in sideways, tail last. Inside, she stood in the middle of the barn floor and looked at everything. The hay, the old tools hanging on the wall, the dusty light coming through the gaps in the boards, with those bright gold eyes moving slowly and carefully over every surface. Then she sat down in a patch of late sunlight that came through the high window. She looked at the three children standing in front of her. Dolly had her notebook out. Pip was already sitting cross-legged on the floor at the creature's level. Bren was standing with his arms crossed, not because he was being guarded, but because he was thinking. "We need a name for her," Pip said. "We can't just say it, or the creature." "She probably has a name," Dolly said. She looked at the creature. "Name?" she said. "Your name?" The creature clicked, long and flowing. It was clearly a name, but it was 9 syllables long and included at least 2 sounds that were not available in any human throat. They all tried it. They all failed completely. The creature watched each attempt with what was unmistakably patience being stretched. "Rissa," Pip said finally, trying to copy the first 2 syllables into something her mouth could manage. "Rissa." The creature went still. Then, very slowly, she dipped her long neck forward, not a bow, exactly, but something like an acknowledgement. "Rissa," she said back, in her own voice, the 2 syllables exact. "Rissa," Pip said again, satisfied. That was how it started. Not with a government, not with a broadcast, not with a scientist or a soldier or a diplomat. With a barn, a granola bar, and 3 children who thought the most important thing was that she had a name to be called by. Outside, the smoke from the wheat field was already thinning. By the time any adult looked out a window, there was nothing in the field but a dark patch and a long groove in the dirt. Nobody went to investigate until the next morning. By then, Rissa had eaten 4 more granola bars, a cheese sandwich, and half an apple, and Dolly had already filled 6 pages of her notebook. On the 3rd day, Rissa got bored. Not quietly bored, loudly bored in the way that only a small, intelligent creature with too much energy and a healing wing can be. She had eaten everything they brought her. She had looked at every tool in the barn at least twice. She had spent one entire afternoon watching a spider build a web in the corner of the high window, which said less about her interest in spiders and more about how desperate she had become for something to engage her mind. When Bryn showed up after school with a football, she watched him kick it against the barn wall 6 times and then turned her head away. When Dolly brought a deck of cards and tried to teach her go fish, Rissa sat through 2 rounds with her golden eyes at half-mast. When Pip dragged in a jigsaw puzzle, 500 pieces, a picture of a lighthouse, Rissa sniffed the box, picked up 1 piece, put it in the wrong place deliberately, and then looked at Pip as if to say, "This is what you do for fun." "She's not impressed," Bren said. "She's bored," Dolly corrected. "Same thing." Rissa stood up and stretched her long neck and made a sound. Not a hiss, not a click, but something low and rolling that they were starting to recognize as the noise she made when she was trying to figure out how to say something in a language she was still learning piece by piece. Her vocabulary had grown quickly over 3 days. She could say all 3 of their names clearly. She could say yes, no, food, good, wait, come, and look. She had learned the word interesting very fast and used it constantly, always for things that were not the jigsaw puzzle. She looked at the 3 of them now with great seriousness. "Game," she said. "We tried games," Bren said. "No." She shook her narrow head. "No. My game." She went to the corner of the barn where she had dragged some loose straw into a rough sleeping pile, which she treated like a den. She pushed some straw aside with her nose and uncovered 3 small objects that had clearly come from the ship. Dark, smooth, roughly triangular, each about the size of a playing card but thicker, and each giving off a faint, barely visible glow at the edges. She carried them back one at a time in her mouth and set them on the barn floor between herself and the children. Then she sat very straight and looked at all 3 of them. "Vreth call," she said. It came out all at once like a single breath. Vreth rhyming with breath, call long and clear at the end. "Vreth call," Dolly repeated, already writing. Rissa nodded once. "Old game," she said. "Draith game." She pointed to herself. "My people. Old. Very old." She touched one of the glowing tiles carefully with one claw. "We play when—" She paused, searching. "When we are this big." She held a claw about a foot off the ground. "Young," Dolly offered. "Yes, young. We learn. Then grow. Then play big version." She spread her wings, just a little, just enough, and folded them back. "Big version very hard. This version," she clicked her tongue. "Also hard. But you can do." Bren sat down on a hay bale. "Okay, how do you play?" Rissa took a breath. What came next was 45 minutes long. She explained with words, drawings scratched in the dirt floor with her claw. The 3 glowing tiles moved around in patterns, sounds, gestures, and at one point a very dramatic physical demonstration that involved her running a tight circle around all 3 children and then sitting down and saying, "You understand?" They did not understand. She explained again. The basic shape of Vreth call, as best Dolly could record it in her notebook, went like this. 2 players, or 2 teams, moved through a defined space, a territory, using a set of positions called steps. Each step had a value, and the value changed depending on what the other side did last. There were 3 kinds of steps: advance, hold, and fold, and each one meant something different at different points in the game. But the territory itself was also part of the game, because certain areas gave advantages and certain areas gave penalties, and the areas changed over time based on a set of rules that Rissa called the breathing of the board. On top of all that, there was a memory layer. Each player had to track every move made from the beginning and could use past moves as calls, which functioned something like evidence in an argument, to challenge or cancel what the other player was currently doing. "So you have to remember everything," Brent said. "Yes." "And the board changes." "Yes." "And what you did 10 moves ago can affect what's happening right now." "Yes." "And there are 3 kinds of moves. 3 basic. Then combinations." Then, Rissa made a gesture with both front claws that suggested layers upon layers. "More." Bryn stared at her. "How long does a game take?" She tilted her head. "Young game? Short game? Half a day." Pip looked up from where she had been sitting quietly on the floor with the 3 tiles in her lap, turning them over in her hands. "What are these for?" Rissa looked at her. "Markers. They remember." "What do they remember?" "Moves. The tiles hold." She searched for the word. "History. Of game. So you cannot lie about what you did." "Like a record," Dolly said. "Record. Yes. Good word." Pip set one tile down on the floor in front of her. She studied the barn floor for a moment. Then she moved the tile slightly to the left, paused, and moved it forward 2 small steps. She stopped and looked at Rissa. Rissa went completely still. Her gold eyes moved to the tile, then to Pip, then to the tile, then back to Pip. "Where did you learn that?" she said, very quietly. Pip blinked. "I didn't. I'm just," she shrugged. "It felt right. The space in the middle looked empty, and that seemed like a bad thing, so I moved toward it." Rissa was silent for a long moment. "That is the first move," she said. "The correct first move. The opening that all Draith children are taught in the first lesson." Bren looked at Pip. "Did you know that?" "No," Pip said simply. "She found it," Rissa said, still staring at Pip. "By feeling." The word feeling came out careful and slow, like she was not sure what to do with it. "In Draith teaching, it takes," she paused, "time. Many days. Before a child makes that move without being told." Dolly was writing at full speed. "What does the move mean?" "It means, I am here, and I am watching, and I am not afraid of the center." Rissa looked around at all 3 of them. "It is a strong thing to say at the beginning." Pip picked up the tile and looked at it. Can we try? A real try? Like actually playing? You don't know enough yet, Bren said. Neither did she when she made the move, Dolly said, still writing. Bren had no answer to that. Rissa watched all three of them and did something with her face that was not quite a smile. Her species did not smile the same way, but was something in that direction. A loosening. A warmth. She had been to 3 other planets before this one, in short hops with her family, and she had never found anything that surprised her. She had been told that surprise was something that happened less and less as you grew older and saw more of the galaxy. She had not expected to be surprised by 3 small humans in a barn. She straightened up. We start slow, she said. I teach 1 part each day. You practice. When you know enough, we play. And if we're bad at it, Bren asked, then you are bad. You practice more. Get less bad. That's very encouraging, Bren said flatly. Rissa looked at him without blinking. Breath call is not for encouraging. It is for learning. There is a difference. Dolly finished writing and tapped her pen against her notebook. Can you tell us why it's secret? You said, secret dragon game, when you first pointed to it. You used that word. Rissa was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes that was harder to read. Breath call is Draith, she said finally. Only Draith. My people do not share it. It is, she searched. Ours. It belongs to us. It is how we teach our young to think, to move, to hold 2 things in mind and not drop either one. She looked at the tiles. There is a rule. You do not play Vreth Call with those outside the Draith. The barn was quiet for a second. But you're teaching us, Pip said. Rissa looked at the 3 tiles on the floor. Yes, she said. I am. She didn't say anything else about it. But the way she looked at those tiles, careful and steady and a little bit defiant, said enough. She was choosing to do it. And that was different from being asked. That night, after the children had gone in for dinner, and Rissa was alone in the barn with the 2 remaining granola bars they had left her, and the last pale light coming through the boards, she sat with the 3 tiles arranged on the floor in front of her and looked at them for a long time. She rearranged them into the opening position. Then she moved one forward, to where Pip had moved it without knowing what it meant. She sat there looking at it until the light was gone. Nobody meant for the barn to get too small. It just happened the way those things do, slowly at first, and then all at once. By the end of the 2nd week, Vrethkal had outgrown 4 walls and a dirt floor. It had spilled out the barn door, crossed the yard, jumped the fence, and taken over a good portion of the countryside. It started because of Dolly's question. She had been reading back through her notebook. 6 pages had become 22, and she looked up during a lesson and asked Rissa what the biggest board she had ever seen looked like. Rissa thought about it and said that the largest Vrethkal she had ever witnessed was played across an entire valley between 2 cliffs, with rocks used as markers and the river at the bottom used as a neutral boundary zone that neither side could hold, but both sides could use for retreat. Dolly wrote that down. Then she looked out the barn door at the fields. The next morning, she brought a hand-drawn map. She had marked the creek that ran behind the property as the neutral zone. She had marked the hollow oak tree at the edge of the woods as a sanctuary tile, her word, borrowed from the rules, where a player could pause and not be challenged for 3 moves. She had marked the old grain silo on the hill as the high throne point, which in Vrethkal meant the position of greatest advantage, the place worth the most in the scoring breath. Rissa looked at the map for a long time without speaking. This is, she made a careful sound. You have built a board. Is it wrong? Dolly asked. No. Rissa turned the map in her claws, studying it. The creek is good. Neutral water is correct. The tree. She tilted her head. A sanctuary is different. In Draith Vrethkal, there is no sanctuary. Once you are in play, you are in play. But there should be, Pip said. She was sitting on a fence post, swinging her feet. Sometimes you need to think. And if someone can just come at you while you're thinking, you never get to think. Rissa looked at her. In a real hunt, there is no time to think. This isn't a real hunt, Pip said. It's a game. Games should be fair. That word, fair, made Rissa very still. It was not a concept that mapped cleanly onto Vrethkal, which was designed to teach young Draith that the world was not fair and that wisdom meant learning to move well inside that fact. But she looked at the map again. She looked at the hollow tree marked on it. She thought about the game they had been trying to play in the barn, cramped and tripping over each other. 3 moves, she said finally. Sanctuary gives 3 moves of protection. No more. Dolly wrote it down. Bryn added it would only apply to the person who got there first, and the game continued for everyone else while they thought, which meant you could not use the sanctuary as a way to stall forever, because things would be changing and moving while you sat still. Rissa stared at him. That is a good rule. Bryn shrugged like he hadn't spent most of the previous night thinking about it. The outdoor game changed everything. They played the first real full session on a Saturday, from mid-morning until the lights started to go orange and long in the afternoon. Rissa ran, which was the first time they had seen her fully run, low and fast and fluid, her tail a straight line behind her, her wings pressed flat. She was quick and she was smart and she knew the game far better than any of them, which meant she was winning by a margin that should have been embarrassing. But the children were not embarrassed. They were furious in the best possible way, focused and competing with every bit of thought they had. Bryn tried to hold the silo. Rissa dislodged him in 4 moves. He retreated to the creek, used the neutral zone the way Dolly had theorized, not as a place to hide, but as a corridor, moving along the bank and appearing on the far side where Rissa had not accounted for him. She adjusted. He adjusted again. Dolly called her first move memory, using a choice Rissa had made 7 rounds ago as a challenge against her current position, which was technically valid under the rules, and which made Rissa stop in the middle of the field and stare at Dolly with gold eyes wide. You remembered that, Rissa said. I wrote it down, Dolly said, holding up the notebook. Rissa looked at the notebook, then at Dolly. In Draith training, she said slowly, we are taught to hold all moves in our heads. No external memory. It is part of the discipline. That sounds exhausting, Dolly said. It is supposed to be. Well, I have a notebook. Can I use it? Rissa considered this for a long moment. There is no rule against it, she said finally, which Dolly took as a yes and Rissa intended as a reluctant admission. Pip invented the long stare by accident. It happened near the end of the session, when she and Rissa arrived at the same position marker, the tall fence post at the south edge of the field, at exactly the same moment, having come from different directions, and stood looking at each other with no clear rule to decide who had claim to it. Rissa clicked through several resolution rules. None of them applied. The situation was a genuine draw by every technical measure. Pip looked at her. Rissa looked at Pip. Neither of them moved. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Bryn and Dolly drifted over to watch. A crow landed on the fence post above them, and then left because even the crow found it too tense. After 4.5 minutes, Rissa sat back on her haunches and made the clicking sound that meant she was yielding the point. You didn't blink, she said. A blink, Pip said. Just not very much. Later, when they were settling the score of the session and Bryn pointed out that there was no official rule for what to do when 2 players hit the same point at the same time from different angles, Rissa said that in formal Draith breath call, it was resolved by a recall round, going back through move history to see who had the older claim on that zone. That takes too long, Bryn said. And it doesn't feel right, Dolly said. The position was tied. Going back to history to break a live tie feels like cheating. What would feel right? Rissa asked. Pip said, they just look at each other until one of them gives up. Rissa tilted her head. The long stare. That's what it should be called, Pip said. And so it was. Dolly wrote it in the notebook. Bryn drew a small box around it, because he said new rules deserved a box. Rissa watched them add it to the record and felt something quietly strange. A rule she had not known an hour ago now existed because 3 humans had looked at a gap in the system and filled it with something logical and their own. Draith did not do that. Draith treated Vrethkal as a fixed thing, passed down, not touched. You learned it. You did not improve it. She did not say this aloud. She filed it somewhere. In the evenings, adults were starting to notice small things. Bryn's Uncle Walt, a retired signals man who lived in the farmhouse and spoke very little but observed very much, had been watching the 3 children from the kitchen window for several days. He noticed they disappeared into the field for hours and came back with dirt on their knees and a strange focused look that children don't usually wear after playing normal games. He noticed Dolly's notebook had gone from being occasionally present to being everywhere. He noticed the coded words they used at dinner. Sanctuary, breath point, fold, call. He didn't say anything yet. He just watched. She had not sent anything further. She told herself the transmitter was unstable and another test could damage it. That was true. She told herself there was no guarantee any Draith receiver was within range. That was also true. She sat in the barn with the glowing tiles on the floor in front of her, and she thought about the outdoor board Dolly had mapped. She thought about the sanctuary rule that should not have worked, but did. She thought about the long stair, which was not in any Draith text, but which was, by any honest measure, the correct solution to that problem. She thought about Pip moving the opening tile correctly on the very first day without being told. She ran the transmitter test twice more that week, carefully, to check the signal strength. Both times she turned it off before it could broadcast. She was not ready to leave yet. She did not ask herself why. She was young enough that asking herself hard questions still felt optional. But the tiles on the floor glowed the way they always glowed, holding the memory of every game played near them, and in the pale light of the barn they looked, just a little, like stars. Rissa sat among them and thought about what it meant that the best new rule in Vrethkal in possibly 100 years had been invented in an afternoon by 3 children who had not known the game existed 2 weeks ago. She thought about that for a long time. Outside, Walt turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and in the field the wheat moved in the dark, and the old silo stood on the hill with the stars above it, high-thrown point of a board that had not existed 3 weeks ago, and now, somehow, felt like it had always been there. The sound came at night, when the barn was quiet and the children were home. It was faint, barely a vibration, more felt than heard, the kind of signal that passed through walls and wood and sleeping fields without disturbing anything except the small device buried in the straw at the far corner of the barn. Rissa heard it because she was awake, which she was most nights because she healed better in the daytime warmth and spent the dark hours thinking and listening. She crossed the barn in 4 steps and uncovered the receiver. The signal was short. A query pulse, not a message. Something was asking if anything was out there, broadcasting on a Draith frequency. It was faint enough that it was probably far out, at the edge of the system, maybe, or just passing through. But it was real and it was close enough to register, and Rissa's transmitter, which she had been testing carefully for days, could reach it. She sat in front of the receiver for a long time. The signal pulsed again, asking, patient and mechanical, the way patrol signals always were. Patrol. Not family. Not a rescue ship sent by her parents, who by now must have been frantic. A patrol unit. There was a difference that mattered enormously in Draith society, and Rissa knew it as well as she knew her own scale pattern. A family rescue was private. A patrol response was formal, logged, and reported up the hierarchy. If a patrol found her, the record of where she had been and what she had been doing for nearly 3 weeks would be filed with the Draith Oversight Council and attached to her family name. Her family name carried weight. Her mother was a Vrethkal master instructor. Her father held a navigator's rank. 3 generations of her line had been careful and respected and exactly where they were supposed to be. She had been hiding in a barn on a primitive, unclassified planet, teaching sacred Draith cultural property to 3 small non-Draith children who did not have interstellar travel and whose species had not been formally catalogued yet. She sat very still, and the patrol signal pulsed a 3rd time. Then she turned the receiver off. In the morning, she told the children. She waited until all 3 of them were there, Bren first, Dolly second, Pip last, who arrived chewing a piece of toast, and stopped chewing when she saw Rissa's expression. Rissa was sitting in the middle of the barn floor, and she was very straight and very still, which she only was when something serious was happening. Someone is coming, she said. She told them everything. The signal, what it meant, what kind of ship it was, what would happen if they found her here. She used more English than she ever had because she needed them to understand exactly, and she went slowly and found words and used her claws in the dirt when words were not enough. Dolly wrote it all down without being asked. Pip finished her toast. Bren stood with his arms crossed and listened. When Rissa finished, the barn was quiet for a moment. Then Bren said, "How long?" "I do not know. The signal was far. Maybe 2 days. Maybe 4. Will they come here specifically, or are they just passing through?" The signal was a search query. It looked for my ship's frequency. If my ship is still broadcasting emergency radiation, and it is, I cannot stop that without parts 1 do not have. Then they will find me. "Okay," Bren said. He uncrossed his arms. "So we have a few days. You understand what I told you?" Rissa said, and there was something careful and strained in the way she said it. like she was making sure he was not treating this as another game move. If they come here, and they find me here with you, teaching you Vrethkal, it is not a small thing. For my family, for my record, Draith Patrol does not treat violations of cultural law lightly. Is it a law? Dolly asked. You said it was a rule. In Draith culture, Rissa said, rules from elders become law when they are old enough. Vrethkal is very old. So you broke a very old law to teach us a game, Bryn said. Yes. Because you wanted to. Yes. Bryn nodded once, slowly. Then we help. Rissa looked at him. You cannot negotiate with a Draith Patrol unit. They are not, she stopped. They are not interested in the opinions of unclassified species. I know, Bryn said. I'm not planning to negotiate. Pip looked up from the barn floor, where she had been sitting cross-legged since Rissa started talking. Have any Draith ever played Vrethkal against someone who isn't a Draith? Rissa blinked. No, it is forbidden. So they've never lost to someone who isn't a Draith. No. Pip nodded, thoughtful. Then they don't know what that feels like. Dolly's pen stopped moving. Bryn went very quiet in the way he went quiet when something clicked into place for him. Rissa stared at Pip and felt that strange sensation again, the one that had no Draith name, the one she kept filing away for later. It was the feeling of watching something you thought you understood reveal an angle you hadn't considered. You are thinking something, Rissa said. I'm always thinking something, Pip said. So is Dolly. She's already writing it. Dolly was indeed writing. If the patrol commander has never lost at Vrethkal to a non-Draith, she said without looking up, then when they arrive they will see us as beneath them, as nothing, as a problem to remove quietly. Yes, Rissa said. But if they've never lost at it to us, Dolly continued, they also can't look down on us for losing, because we've never played them. Bryn picked it up from there. And if we challenge them before they get a chance to decide what we are, then we define what we are, Dolly finished. Rissa's tail twitched. A challenge, she said slowly. A formal challenge under Vrethkal rules, issued by a non-Draith. She paused. This has never been done. That's the point, Bryn said. The patrol commander will be a senior rank. They have years of Vrethkal. Training, practice, formal matches. How many years? Pip asked. For a senior patrol rank? 20 years. Perhaps 30. Pip thought about this. We've been playing for 2 weeks. Yes. Then we're going to lose. Almost certainly. Pip shrugged. Okay, but will they take the challenge? Rissa thought about the culture she had grown up in. She thought about pride, which Draith had in enormous quantity. She thought about what it would mean for a senior patrol officer to refuse a challenge from 3 small, uncatalogued children on an unclassified planet. They cannot refuse, she said quietly. To refuse a formal Vrethkal challenge it cannot be done. Not by any Draith who wants to keep their standing. Bryn nodded. Then we're going to lose a very important game that we have to play and they have to accept, and then we'll see what happens. It was not much of a plan, but it was something, and it was theirs. Wold appeared in the barn doorway in the late afternoon. Nobody had heard him come across the yard. He was a quiet man, not secretive, just economical, the kind of quiet that came from years of listening more than speaking. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at Rissa for a long moment without any particular expression. Rissa looked back at him, wings half raised on instinct before she remembered, and folded them down. Walt said, I've known about her for 8 days. The 3 children turned to look at him. The emergency radiation from the ship, he said to Rissa, ignoring the children for a moment. It's a frequency I recognize from old classified briefings. Nothing dramatic. They just told us what to look for in case something came down in a rural area. So I looked. He paused. I chose not to report it. A long silence. Why? Dolly asked. Walt looked at his niece and nephew and the small girl who was always sitting on floors. Because you were handling it fine, he said. And because the people I would have reported it to would have handled it very badly. He looked back at Rissa. You're a child. Rissa blinked. I am a juvenile Draith, yes. Same thing, Walt said. In my experience, frightened children, any kind, do better with other children than with officials. He stepped into the barn, looked around at the tiles on the floor, at Dolly's notebook on the hay bale, at the map pinned to the wall. Now, he said, tell me about these people coming, and tell me what the plan is. I'd like to help, if that's acceptable. Rissa looked at him. She looked at the three children. She looked at the barn around her, the map, the notebook, the marks in the dirt floor where 100 game moves had been scratched and redrawn. "You are not afraid," she said to Walt. "No," Walt said. "We are not afraid either," Pip said. "I know," Rissa said. "I have been wondering about that since the first day." She moved one of the glowing tiles forward on the floor, the opening move, the one Pip had found by instinct on the first day. "Your species does not fear the way I expected you to." Walt looked at the tile. "Does that mean yes?" Rissa dipped her head in the Draith gesture that now they all recognized. "Yes," she said. "You can help." Outside, the wheat moved. The silo stood on the hill. Somewhere at the edge of the system, a patrol ship followed a signal toward a small blue planet it had no particular interest in. It did not know yet that 3 children had made a plan for its arrival. It did not know yet about the long stare. And it did not know that the notebook on that hay bale had 26 pages of Vrethkal theory written in the careful hand of a 9-year-old who never forgot anything she wrote down. They came down in the evening, when the light was low and the shadows across the wheat field were long. The ship was not dramatic. It did not blaze. It descended in a controlled, deliberate line, landed with a precision that left the wheat around it barely disturbed, and settled onto 4 wide legs with a sound like a deep breath being let out. It was dark-colored, angular, 3 times the size of Rissa's ship, and it had a kind of stillness after landing that made it feel less like a machine and more like something alive that had decided to stop moving temporarily. 3 figures stepped out. The 2 flanking ones were soldiers. That much was clear from the way they moved, measured, aware, eyes going to all corners of the field at once. They were larger than Rissa, fully grown, their scales darker and thicker, and they carried nothing obvious as weapons but held themselves in the way that things do when they don't need obvious weapons. The one in the center was different. He was older, broader across the chest. His scales had the faded, layered look of something that had seen decades of weather across multiple planets. One of his eyes had a scar running through the outer corner of it, pale against dark green, old enough that it had long stopped matching to anything except appearance. He moved without any urgency at all. He crossed the field toward the barn with the quiet, unhurried pace of someone who had never once been rushed by anything and did not intend to start. His name, Rissa had told them, was Draff. He was a senior patrol commander, 31 years of service. Vrethkal ranked at the 3rd tier of mastery, which Rissa had explained meant he could play blindfolded with one opponent calling moves verbally and still win within 40 rounds. Bren was watching from the barn door. He stepped back inside, took one breath, and said, "He's older than I thought." "I told you he would be old," Rissa said. "Knowing it and seeing it are different." "Yes," Rissa agreed. She was standing in the center of the barn, wings tight, tail curled near her feet. She looked young and small in a way she did not usually look. "Bren." "Yes." "You do not have to do this." Bren looked at her. "I know." Drav stopped at the barn door. He looked in. His expression was not hostile. It was formal, the specific kind of formal that was almost colder than hostility, because it meant you did not matter enough to be angry at. He spoke to Rissa and Draith, a short, precise set of sounds that even after 3 weeks none of the children could follow. Rissa answered in Draith. Her voice was steady. She was better at formal than any of them expected her to be, which made sense when you remembered whose daughter she was. Drav replied. His gold eyes moved from Rissa to the 3 children in a single, slow pass. He did not look at Walt, who was sitting on a hay bale near the wall, drinking tea from a thermos, doing a remarkable impression of someone who was simply present and had no particular thoughts about anything. Drav looked at the children the way you look at furniture, noting it, placing it, moving on. Then Bren spoke. He said it in Draith. Badly. The sounds were approximate and some of the syllables fell in the wrong place. But the words were the right words because Rissa had made him practice them over and over the last 2 nights, and Dolly had written them out phonetically in the notebook, and he had said them under his breath so many times that he could have said them in his sleep. He issued a formal challenge of Vrethkal. He, his 2 partners, and Rissa, who was injured and would play on the challenging side, against the commander, in a single session, on the board already established outside. If the commander's side won, they left without argument and without further complication. If the challenging side held any point to a draw, not even a win, a draw, The commander acknowledged the match was played. The barn was very quiet after that. Drav's two soldiers looked at each other. Drav himself did not look at them. He was looking at Bryn with an expression that was, for the first time, not the furniture look. It was something more careful than that. He said one word in Drath. Rissa translated for the children. He wants to know who taught you the challenge form. You, Bryn said, nodding to Rissa. Drav looked at Rissa. He said something else, longer. Rissa said quietly, he wants to know if I know what the challenge means. For my record. For my family. Yes, she said to Drav in Drath. I know. Drav was quiet for a long moment. The whole evening seemed quiet around him. A bird called once somewhere in the field and went silent. Then Drav said, accepted, in Drath, but also, clearly, a word that needed no translation. One of the soldiers made a sound that might have been a protest. Drav raised one claw, just slightly, and the soldier was immediately silent. They played outside. What followed was not elegant. It was not the careful, formal Vreth call of Drath training grounds. It was loud and wide and complicated and completely extraordinary. The field, the creek, the hollow oak, the silo, all of it came into play within the first 20 minutes. Drav was fast, far faster than they expected, covering ground with the same unhurried certainty that characterized everything about him, appearing at positions before anyone had seen him move. He understood the environmental board immediately, reading Dolly's marks and tile placements in under 2 minutes with no explanation, and began using it against them before the children had finished their opening positions. Bryn tried to hold the silo. He lasted longer than last time, 14 rounds before Drav displaced him, but he had learned from the first attempt, and when he fell back it was along a line he had planned in advance, and he hit the creek corridor and used it the same way he had used it against Rissa, materializing on the far side at a point Drav had assumed was uncontested. Drav paused, just for a moment. Then he adjusted. Dolly called a move memory in round 22, citing something Drav had done in round 7, holding it up as a contradiction to what he was doing now, using the notebook as her evidence. Drav stared at the notebook with an expression the children could not fully read, but Rissa, watching from her position near the oak, recognized as something very close to respect in its most reluctant form. He accepted the call. He had to. The record was right. Pip was everywhere and nowhere. This was the most unsettling thing about playing Pip, which Rissa had learned over 2 weeks, and which Drav was learning now in real time. Pip did not play to win positions. She played to be in the place where something was about to happen a moment before it happened. She arrived at the right tile at the right moment by a combination of instinct and observation that was not quite strategy in any formal sense, but produced strategic outcomes with an efficiency that made no logical sense. 3 times Drav reached for a position, and Pip was already there, sitting cross-legged on the ground beside the relevant marker, looking up at him with her expression of complete calm. Drav's second-in-command walked over to Walt at some point during round 30 and stood beside him without speaking. Walt poured tea into the thermos cap and offered it. The soldier looked at it, then took it. They stood in companionable silence watching the game. Rissa played hurt. Her wing was still not right, and her range was limited, but she played the way she had been trained to play, thinking in layers, holding all previous moves in her head without writing them down, seeing the board not as it was now, but as it would be in 5 rounds if nothing changed, and then planning to change things. She was the only one on their side who could read Drav's strategy at full depth, and she spent the middle section of the game shadowing his moves and countering them a half step behind, not winning exchanges, but preventing him from building the positional strength he needed to close the game out. They were still playing when the sky turned dark purple and the first stars came out. At round 47, Pip and Drav arrived at the silo's base marker at the same time, coming from opposite ends of the field, neither having seen the other en route. They stood looking at each other. Round 47. The game hung on this point. Whoever held the silo's base entering the final phase had the high throne advantage, and the session would tip toward them. Drav was a senior commander with 31 years. Pip was 7 years old and slightly muddy. Pip looked at him. He looked at her. Long stare. Bryn called from across the field, which meant everyone knew the rule was in effect. Drav did not know the rule. Rissa called it out to him in Drath. 1 sentence. Fast. He processed it. He had to accept it because it was listed in Dolly's notebook as a formally agreed variant rule, declared before the session began. He looked at Pip. Pip looked at him. A minute passed, then two. Drav was very still, the stillness of someone who knew stillness as a skill, as a trained capability. His eyes did not waver. His body did not shift. Pip scratched her nose. Then she went still too. 3 minutes. 4. One of Drav's soldiers had drifted over to watch. Even Bran, who had already conceded his position, came and stood nearby with his arms crossed. At 6 minutes and 14 seconds, Commander Drav of the Draith Patrol, 31 years of service, 3rd tier Vreth Call Master, sat back on his haunches. He said one word in Draith. Rissa, from across the field, made a sound, short and sharp and involuntary, that everyone who knew her recognized immediately. It was the Draith equivalent of a laugh. Dolly looked at her notebook. What did he say? He said, "Enough," Rissa said, in the formal register. The register used to close a match. Bren stared. He yielded. The long stare, Rissa said, and she was still making that sound, small and helpless and unable to stop. He was beaten by the long stare. Walt's voice came from near the barn. Tea's still warm if anyone wants it. Drav stood up from his position and walked across the field to Rissa. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said something long and low in Draith, and his tone had changed in a way that was hard to name. It was still formal, still composed, but the furniture look was gone. She was not furniture anymore. None of them were. Rissa answered quietly. What did he say? Pip asked. Rissa looked at the children. He said the match result is noted. He said, she paused, finding the English. He said he has not been held to a draw since his 3rd year of training. She paused again. He asked who taught me this variant. What did you tell him? I told him I did not teach it. I told him they built it. She looked at the 3 of them, muddy, tired, completely unfazed. I told him I only gave them the frame. They made the house. Drav stood in the dark field under the first real stars of the evening, and if a Draith senior patrol commander could look uncertain, he looked uncertain then. He looked at the children, at Rissa, at the barn, at Walt, who was offering tea again with the focused generosity of a man who had decided tea was his contribution to history and he was going to make it count. He did not speak for a long time. Then he spoke to Rissa. She translated. He needs time to consider what he has observed. He will speak in the morning. What does that mean? Bren asked. Rissa watched Drav walk back toward his ship. It means, she said carefully, that he has not yet decided what to do, and that a Draith who has not yet decided says so plainly rather than pretending. That's honest, Dolly said. Yes, Rissa said. Whatever else he is honest. The stars were fully out now. The board, the field, the creek, the oak, the old silo on the hill, lay quiet around them, the tiles still glowing faintly in the dark. Pip sat down in the grass and looked at the sky. Bren sat beside her. Dolly wrote in her notebook by the light of her phone. Rissa sat among them and did not go into the barn. For the first time since the crash, she wanted to stay outside. Drav came to the barn in the morning while the dew was still heavy on the grass. He came alone, which meant something. In Draith protocol, a commander who came alone was not there in an official capacity. He was there as an individual, which meant whatever was said would not be logged or filed. It was a distinction that Rissa understood the moment she saw him cross the yard without his soldiers, and she felt the tight thing in her chest loosen very slightly. Bren, Dolly, and Pip were already there. Walt had made a pot of something warm and left it on the fence post with 4 cups. He was not in the barn, which was also deliberate. Walt was very good at knowing when to be present and when not to be. Drav stepped inside and looked around the barn with a different quality of attention than he had shown the night before. Last night he had been assessing. This morning he was looking. There was a difference. He looked at the dirt floor with the marks of 100 game sessions scratched into it. He looked at the map on the wall, Dolly's hand-drawn outdoor board with every tile position marked and annotated in her careful writing. He looked at the notebook. He pointed to the notebook. He said something. Rissa said, "He is asking if he may read it." Dolly looked at the notebook in her lap. She held it out. Drav took it. He sat down, not on the hay bale, just cross-legged on the barn floor, which nobody had expected, and he read. He read slowly and completely, every page. He did not ask for translation. Draith scholars learned multiple written scripts as a standard part of their education, and whatever Dolly's handwriting was, it was legible. Nobody spoke while he read. The barn was very quiet. Outside, a cow moved somewhere. A bird argued with another bird briefly and then gave up. Drav turned the last page. He went back to 3 earlier pages and looked at them again. Then he closed the notebook and held it for a moment without speaking. When he spoke for a long time, and Rissa translated in pieces. He said, the sanctuary rule was structurally sound. He had seen its logic immediately. He said there was, in old Draith texts, a precursor concept that had been removed from Vrethkal roughly 200 years ago because it was considered too gentle for the game's purpose. The children had independently arrived at a better version of the removed concept and then strengthened it with the time limit condition, which the original had not had. He said, the move memory rule using an external record rather than internal recall was technically not prohibited by any line in the formal text. He had checked, in his mind, against everything he knew. It was not prohibited. It was assumed to be impossible, so it had not been addressed. The assumption was wrong. He said, the long stare was the most interesting tiebreaker mechanism he had encountered in 31 years of playing. It was also, he admitted, effective. He said this last part without particular expression, but the words themselves carried something. Then he said something shorter and more direct. Rissa was quiet for a moment after that one. What? Bryn said. He said, this game is better now than it was 3 weeks ago. She paused. He means the variant you built. He is saying it is an improvement on what existed. The barn was very quiet. Drav handed the notebook back to Dolly. He looked at Rissa and spoke again. He is invoking cultural study protocol, Rissa said slowly, like she was still parsing it. It is a provision in Draith law. If an officer in the field observes a phenomenon of significant cultural interest, they may authorize an extended observation period for formal study purposes. She looked at Drav. He is authorizing 3 months. 3 months for what? Bryn asked. For me to stay. Rissa's voice was very even. For him to file a report that says the situation requires extended observation rather than immediate resolution. It means he goes. He files the report. The council reads it. And by the time any formal response comes back, 3 months have passed, and the window reopens for review. He's giving you time, Dolly said. Yes. By calling it a study. Yes. Because he can't just say leave her there. She's teaching children a sacred game. Rissa looked at Dolly. No, he cannot say that. But he can say he observed a phenomenon of significant cultural interest and that the formal Draith response should take into account data still being gathered. She looked back at Drav. It is a way of doing the right thing without saying the words. Drav looked at Rissa and said one more thing, quieter than everything else. Rissa did not translate it immediately. Rissa, Pip said. Rissa looked at the children. He said, your mother's Vrethkal students play like they are reciting a lesson. These 3 play like they are in a conversation. She paused. He said he understands now why I stayed. Nobody said anything to that. Drav stood. He looked at Dolly's notebook one more time, where it sat in her lap. He gave it one small, deliberate nod. Not to Dolly, but to the notebook itself, as if he were acknowledging something that lived in it. Then he walked out of the barn and across the yard and back to his ship. His second-in-command was waiting at the ramp. He said something to her, short. She looked at the barn with wide eyes, then back at him, then gave a quick formal response and went up the ramp. The ship rose without drama, same as it had landed, and then it was just a dark shape getting smaller against the morning sky, and then it was gone. Walt appeared with the pot of warm drink. Well, he said, I suppose that went reasonably well. That was 3 months ago. The sky is gray this October morning, and the wheat has been cut, and the field is stubble and silence, but the outdoor board is still marked because Dolly remarks it every week so the tile positions don't fade. The silo is still the high thrown point. The creek is still the neutral zone. The hollow oak is still the sanctuary. Rissa sits on top of the barn, which she has discovered she likes because she can see the whole board from there. Her wing is fully healed now. She has not tested it for flight distance, but she knows it would carry her far enough. She does not go far. She is watching the field. In the field are people she did not know existed 4 weeks ago. There are 6 of them, adults, Draith, dressed not in patrol uniform but in the layered, practical clothes of scholars. They arrived 2 days ago in a small civilian transport with the sigil of the Draith Cultural Archive on its side. They brought their own equipment, their own supplies, and a letter from Drav's report, which, it turned out, had circulated through the Draith's scholarly network at a speed that suggested someone had sent it to more than just the council. The scholars are playing Vrethkal with Bryn and Dolly and Pip. Or, more accurately, they are trying. Bryn has had 2 weeks to prepare for this. He has been running them through the outdoor board from the start, which confuses the scholars because they trained on a fixed floor surface. Dolly has issued each of them a copy of the relevant pages from her notebook as pre-reading, which none of them have fully processed because the move memory system is not how they were trained. Pip is sitting across from the senior scholar, a gray-scaled female named something that sounded like clicking stones, and Pip's expression is her usual expression, which is no expression at all. The senior scholar is already a little worried about Pip. The variant version of Vrethkal played on this stubble and creek and silo board now has an official designation in the Draith archive. Rissa found out 2 days ago when the scholars arrived with their formal documents. It is called Vrethkal Brendal Pip. 3 syllables, 3 names, combined into one, which is what you did in Draith naming convention when a work was created by a group. It sits in the archive as a registered variant, the first new registered variant in 60 years, the first ever created by a non-Draith, the first in all of recorded Draith history to include a rule invented on the spot during a tie break by a 7-year-old with a quiet face and very functional blinking. Rissa watches the scholars struggle with the sanctuary rule. She watches Bren explain it again patiently, which is not something anyone who knew him 3 months ago would have predicted. She watches Dolly produce her notebook when a question about the move memory system comes up, and the senior scholar reaches for it with both hands and reads it the way Drav read it. Seriously, carefully, going back to check things. The long stare has not yet come up. It will. It always does. Rissa has been thinking about what Drav said in the barn on that last morning. She has been thinking about it in the way that things live in you when they settle too deep to examine directly, present always, but not always in front of you. She has been thinking about what it means that her mother's students play like they are reciting a lesson. She thinks about how she played before she came here. She recited. She was good at reciting. She had an excellent memory, fast instincts, strong positional sense. She could reproduce any line of play from any formal session in her training. She knew the game the way you know the words to something old and important. She did not know it the way you know a conversation. She knows it differently now. Below her, Pip makes a move. The senior scholar goes still. There is a pause, and then the scholar says something in Draith, and Rissa, from the roof, knows what word it is before Pip asks for the translation. The word is interesting. Pip looks up at the roof. She does not wave, but she looks, and Rissa looks back, and between them passes something that neither species has a single clean word for. It is the thing that happens when 2 people, whatever kind of people they are, have been through something together that changed the shape of both of them, and they know it, and they don't need to say it because it is simply true, and true things don't require announcement. Rissa looks up from Pip to the wider sky. Somewhere up there, in the layers of atmosphere and beyond them, is everything she came from and everything she will return to eventually. A family who has been worried sick. A culture that will have opinions about what she did here. A future that will be shaped, partly, by those opinions. And somewhere in the Draith archive, between old texts and formal histories and the names of masters and the records of great matches, is her name, too, now, attached to a variant no one expected, next to 3 human names that no Draith child had ever heard before and that every Draith child who learns Vrethkal will hear from now on. It is a lot. She is still young enough to find it overwhelming if she thinks about it fully, so she mostly does not think about it fully. She sits on the barn roof, and she watches the game below, and she feels something her species does not have a word for. She has learned, in the week she has been here, that humans say pride for a version of it, but it is not quite that. It is quieter than pride. More like the specific warmth of knowing you did a true thing in the right moment, and that the true thing will outlast you. She does not have a word for it. But Draith and human children have been playing a game for 3 months now, and in the barn below her there is a notebook with 26 pages in a 9-year-old's handwriting, and somewhere at the edge of known space a patrol commander filed a report that said, something worth knowing is happening here. So perhaps the word does not matter. Perhaps some things are large enough to not need one. Down in the field, Pip has begun the long stare. The senior Draith scholar is trying her best. Rissa watches, and does not need a word for it at all.